Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and this is my Sharks quarterly grades for the defensemen and the goaltending, this being, of course, the fourth quarter. And I pointed out in my forward quarterly grades that it was not a very strong final quarter of the season for the San Jose Sharks, but at least offensively it wasn't that bad. Defensively, on the other hand, it was a bit of a tire fire, as the 10-game stretch in which the Sharks ended up going 1-8-1 was just very bad for both the defense and the goaltending. And a 10-game stretch over an 82-game season isn't really that much. For instance, the Buffalo Sabres, they had a 10-game winning streak this season, and yet they finished near the bottom of the league because, as I said, 10 games over an 82-game season, it's a lot, but it's not season-altering. However, 10 games over just a 21-game quarter is basically half of it, and as such, a lot of these players' grades suffer because of just how poor the majority of them did play during that stretch. So I think who really personifies this is Brendan Dillon up first. He has actually had solid grades all around, a B- to start, but then a B+ and an A-. But in this quarter, while he was very strong at the start of it during that winning streak the Sharks did have, he continued to be one of the better Sharks defenders. He was one of the worst during the 10-game stretch where the Sharks ended up going 1-8-1. He only put up a couple of points. I think he had 3 or 4 during this 21-game stretch. And so all in all, not a very good set of games for Brendan Dillon when you take everything into account. And as such, he ends up with his lowest grade of the year with a C+. Next is Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who over the first 3 quarters hasn't been that good. His highest grade has been a B-, which he got in the first and third quarters. He got a C- in the second quarter, and yet Vlasic really picked up his game during these 21-game stretch. He may have been the best defenseman for the Sharks during that stretch of 10 games where the Sharks were really struggling. I mean, him and Heed, while they weren't very good, they weren't that bad, at least in comparison to the 4 other defenders playing. Vlasic also racked up a ton of points. Somehow he ended up, I think, with 13 points during this 21-game stretch. I don't even think he has 20 points on the year, if anything. Maybe he has 20 something, but the majority of the points came here in this fourth quarter. He was actually quite good. So before that 10-game stretch where the Sharks just completely fell apart, Vlasic was playing some decent hockey. He wasn't the best, but he wasn't that bad, at least as he was at the start of the season. And he sort of continued that pace even when the Sharks were losing. And so all in all, it was a pretty solid set of games for Marc-Edouard Vlasic, and he ends up with actually the highest grade here with a B+. Next is Joakim Ryan, as he ends up just barely qualifying for this with 10 games over the 21-game stretch. I decided to include him just so I could, trash talk him a bit more, because Ryan has just been a complete mess during this stretch of games. He doesn't get an F necessarily because he hasn't been terrible in every single game he's played. I have said his first game he played filling in for Shemek wasn't that bad. His final game of the season wasn't that bad, but a lot of his play doesn't really inspire hope as him being that 6th defenseman going into the playoffs. So he will technically get the lowest grade I have ever given this season when he receives this D, not a D-, but still the worst grade that I've given out, because Ryan has probably played the worst stretch of 21 games, or 10 games, that I have seen a Sharks player do so far this season. Next is Justin Braun, whose criticisms are very similar to that of Brendan Dillon. He was playing quite well before that losing streak started for the San Jose Sharks. Some solid defensive hockey. He was getting a good amount of minutes, 22 minutes, sometimes even 23 minutes a game. He was against some of the opposing team's top players, but it completely fell apart during that 10-game stretch, and you could definitely argue Justin Braun was the worst defenseman during that time, just racking up the minus during this really entire quarter, and so it wasn't that successful. This is going to be his worst grade yet, as he's been mostly okay during this season, and he will receive the grade of a C. Next is Tim Heed, who of course in the first 2 quarters did not play enough games to be ranked, but in the third quarter he did end up with a B-, and as I said about Marc-Edouard Vlasic, Tim Heed also maintained a pretty steady pace. Nothing super impressive, but nothing too bad. He actually ended up with a decent amount of points. I think he had 7 or 8 points during this stretch, so pretty good for him, and you could definitely say his defense wasn't great, and at times it did look quite shaky, especially during that 10-game break, but it wasn't as bad as some of the other players. I mean, he was probably in the upper half when you consider Dylan, Ryan, and Braun and how poor they were during that 10-game stretch. So Tim Heed will get at least a decently respectable grade of a B-. Finally, we have Brent Burns, who you could definitely point to as being the defensive MVP this season, as he received an A- in the first quarter, a B+ in the second quarter, as well as an A in the third quarter. But Brent Burns wasn't as great in this one, partially because of that offense. He only had 15 points during this 21 games, which, of course, for defensemen saying only 15 points in 21 games, which spans out to just about 60 points on the year, is actually quite impressive for the majority of defensemen. I mean, any other defenseman on this list, it would be crazy if they managed to get 15 points. But for Brent Burns, it wasn't as good. And his defense, while he wasn't the worst of the worst during that 10-game stretch, he wasn't very good either. As I said, you could even potentially rank Tim Heed's defense above Brent Burns, because he's just having some pretty poor giveaways when he's in his own zone. It seems as though he doesn't really think ahead when he tries to make, let's say, a clear, and it ends up being kept in by the other team. And as such, Brent Burns' grade does still suffer somewhat. The 15 points keeps it afloat and keeps it near the upper half here, but he only gets the grade of a B, which will end up being his worst grade of the year. On to the goaltenders, we have Martin Jones. He received a C at the start, but he's gotten a couple of Bs in the last 2 quarters. For Martin Jones, I believe he started 16 games. He wasn't very good for a good chunk of those. He was okay during that winning streak, but he was quite bad during the majority of the lost games. A couple of them you could blame on the defense, but a couple of them you could definitely put on Martin Jones. It wasn't a good stretch of games here for Martin Jones, and while there were some bright spots, he shut out the Minnesota Wild at some point. He had a couple solid games earlier on. He finished the season off strong against the Colorado Avalanche. All in all, it just wasn't really good enough, and he's actually also going to get his worst grade of the year, which seems to be a theme here, with a C-. Next is Aaron Dell, who started off the season pretty well with a B, but his last 2 quarters haven't been great with a C- and a C+. Aaron Dell started 5 games during this stretch, and he was very bad in games against Calgary and Anaheim. He was pretty good in his most recent one, his final one against the Edmonton Oilers. He was okay in a victory against the Winnipeg Jets. He wasn't great in a victory against the Red Wings, but he was solid in relief of Martin Jones in the loss, the 7-3 loss to the Golden Knights. So all in all, it wasn't a horrific set of games for Aaron Dell, but he just looked so lost too many times. He sort of lost a couple of points even for the San Jose Sharks in his limited amount of time that he did play, so he will actually match Martin Jones in terms of grade when he also receives a C-. However, of course, that's not his worst grade ever, as he did have a C- in the second quarter. But that will do it for these grades. It was a pretty down quarter for the majority of the defensemen, except, I guess you could say, Marc-Edouard Vlasic and Tim Heed. Tim Heed not getting any worse than he was, not getting any better either. And Vlasic, because of his offensive outputs and because of the fact that he was probably the best of the worst here during the majority of this quarter, he ends up with a B+, but otherwise not great, and it's not the best sign heading into the playoffs, especially against a team like the Golden Knights. But we'll see if the Sharks can shore up defensively, and especially goaltending wise, when they go into that series. Class dismissed.